Now, moving on to what you described earlier this month when we were putting together our agenda for this month's watching brief as the media event of the month, although notably not one of our media picks for the month, interestingly. This has been a very busy month, I think, for archaeological media. We really should just take some time to talk about and to acknowledge a film called They Shall Not Grow Old. This is a film that was released to coincide with the commemoration and reflection upon Armistice, the 11th of November 2018, marking the end of the Great War 100 years on, and was a joint commission from the Imperial War Museum and the BBC, working in conjunction with Weta Workshop, Peter Jackson's production studio based in New Zealand. And it was fascinating to watch, in so much as it definitely achieved its goal of focusing one's reflection and attention on, in particular, the Western Front in Europe. But it's also a film that's garnered a little bit of criticism, or at the very least has had people asking certain philosophical and ethical questions, I suppose, about its value as a document, a historical document. And for that reason, I think it'd be interesting just to talk about it in this segment. So, I suppose first of all, how has this movie come about? What's happened with the footage? What has had to happen to this footage to bring it to the state that we saw it earlier this month in that movie?
Okay, for the last 100 years, really since the films that form the basis of They Shall Not Grow Old were first shown as newsreels in cinemas in England and the then Empire in 1914 to 1918.
Mm-hmm.
Audiences have been used to seeing the Great War, World War One, the First World War, whatever you want to call it, as a black and white event that was silent.
Mm-hmm.
The soundtrack was provided by the voices of the poets like Wilfred Owen describing the experience and so on, and latterly through oral histories relating to veterans who began to be recorded really in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the voices were distant. Now, what this film has done very cleverly, and it was clearly designed as a piece of event filmmaking by the Imperial War Museum, the BBC, working with Peter Jackson's Weta Workshops.
Mm-hmm.
They combined the film archive of the Imperial War Museum, and it's also its oral history archive, with another oral history archive that the BBC created when it made a film series called The Great War in 1964 for the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of World War One.
Mm-hmm.
And modern filmmaking techniques. And so what they did was take the black and white footage that had really only ever been seen in black and white. They smoothed out the frame rates because film that was taken at that period was generally shot on hand crank cameras, and because of the difficulty of maintaining an even turn on the lever. That's right. You've seen it in the cartoons
charades
and so on.
Yeah,
absolutely. Because it's very difficult to maintain an absolutely even turn rate, particularly on a long take,
and particularly in a war zone.
And particularly in a war zone when there's whiz bangs going off all around you and so on. The frame rate could actually vary between sort of 22, 24 frames a second, which is a more normal projection rate, and 16, 18 frames, or even less in some cases, which makes the film appear like one of those flick books that you make, where you do. I don't know whether you made them when you were a kid, but you make a flick book with a character, a stick man that kicks a football, or a bird that flies across the flick book.
I still make them.
Really unnatural.
But yes, that sort of jerky footage, especially with so if someone's trying to make a film look old, they will lower the frame rate, they'll add some grain, they'll make it black and white, and so in that sense, it is the opposite of, I suppose, what we expect from modern cinema in particular, where we're accustomed to a very naturalistic frame rate that replicates what we see with our eyes.
And visually, that's exactly what Weta and Jackson brought to the project, because rather than just take do a transfer of an Imperial War Museum archive film and cut it into a documentary, which is what you normally see in TV documentaries.
Mm.
They took the archive film, they created a narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and then they took the archive film, digitized it, smoothed out the frame rates by adding digitally extra frames where they needed them,
Mm-hmm.
and then they digitally colorized in HD.
Mm.
And the overall effect is to make something look much more natural, much more immediate.
Mm-hmm.
When you can see the color of somebody's hair or the fact they've got freckles,
Mm. Mm.
when you can see the color of their unit badges
Or
on their uniforms.
or in one guy's case, the color of his teeth. You know.
Indeed,
Yeah.
indeed,
Mm.
absolutely. Yeah, there's a textbook example of of dental techniques for working class men 100 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is the overall effect is very immediate.
Mm.
Now that's just the visual effect.
Mm.
What they also did with the oral history archive, was to take as their narrative frame. There's no overarching narrator.
Mm-hmm.
All what you have is the comments of veterans as they were recorded, commenting on sequences, not necessarily on the sequences that you actually see, but on events like the sequences you actually see.
Mm. Yeah. So people
Uh,
who may be in the same battle or that same particular
that's
element
right.
of yeah.
Or describing what life was like in a trench or
Yeah.
something like that. So you don't see them in the trench.
No.
What you hear is their experience of the trench against this digitized colorized footage of life in a trench.
Yeah.
And then they went one step further even than that, that they first of all added a modern digital ambient soundtrack,
Mm-hmm.
so that you hear horses' hooves, you hear a shell exploding, you know all the ambient sounds that will be part of a scene like that. For example, if if people have seen Steven Spielberg's War Horse and have seen the recreations of the Western Front in that,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they're doing a similar level of detail.
Mm.
And the icing on the digital oral cake really was they then took lip readers who looked at the footage, and where people seemed to be speaking, they worked out what words they were speaking and then voiced those words with the voices of actors using an appropriate regional accent. If, for example, it was a Yorkshire regiment or a Lancashire regiment or a London regiment, you heard an appropriate regional accent stating words that were actually said at the time, but of course were never recorded.
And well, what was quite nice there was you got a real sense of the banter, especially when the camera's on, pointing at these guys. Maybe they're sitting around a table or something, or so at one point, one image that really struck me was a guy following his mate along, tapping him on the head with a plank, and you hear this clunk clunk on his helmet. So you got, I think that was a very very effective way of portraying the humanity of these people on the front, in so much as they were lip reading the some of the silly things they were saying to each other, and you see that right there, I think, goes to the heart of the value of this as a film, is that it's a visceral reminder of the characters that were involved in the conflict. Even actually, when you hear the interviews from 50 years later, either memories have faded, or because of the generation that these men were from, they had a certain matter-of-fact way of talking about their experiences that does have the effect of distancing you from the conflict. Whereas actually seeing, at times horrific, but at times genuinely smile-inducing, I'm not going to say amusing, smile-inducing moments, it's a visceral experience, and it has also, though, oddly enough, been criticised. People are saying, well, actually, this is a fake experience. This is what you're doing is you're falsifying footage from the time, and you're creating something that's simply there to keep our modern attention. And I'm not sure I agree. I think that this is simply a document that is trying to appeal to us on a different level, in a different way. It's not pretending to be footage from the time. Well, the thing is, it is footage from the time. That's the weird thing. But it's just footage that's presented. I mean, I want to hear your view on this as well. But something that so I saw someone commenting on this on the Archaeology Facebook page, and they were sort of saying, well, I'm not really sure how I feel about this, and isn't this a sad, essentially a sad reflection of modern people's sensibilities? But in that sense, I feel about this film the same way that I feel about a museum curator deciding to present a narrative by selecting elements from the museum's collection and putting them into cabinets with certain backgrounds, and an artist. There'll be an art director in that gallery, taking you through a narrative. Of course, it's curated, but none of us have the time to go through hundreds of thousands of hours of footage and create our own narrative. This is, in that sense, Peter Jackson's curated experience, and I think that's okay. I mean, what do you think?
I'm very much with you on this one. I think it is, well, first of all, it's a remarkable technical achievement.
Yes.
And it does make the experience seem very immediate. And that's good, because when I say experience, it's actually a range of experiences, because there are the things you'd expect. There are horrific images in it, injured and dead men and horses and destruction and all the things you expect. It ticks all the First World War was horrific boxes.
Well, in that sense, the flashes of red where you see blood, for example, which you never see in the black and white footage.
No, absolutely. But what is really clever and subtle about it, and actually is in line with contemporary scholarship about World War One, and you made the point about the banter. You are not seeing lions led by donkeys. The working class soldiers are all victims. They're not victims. They've got their own agency. They've got their own culture. They've got their own. They're living their own experiences and making it what they're. And okay, yes, there are probably scenes in there that were staged for the cameras. They're also, very interestingly, you get a sense that people very recently had taken on board a very recent cultural change, which is the fact that cameras might be around and show them. And you do hear stories that families will go to the newsreel every day hoping that they might see images from the Western Front of their son or brother or partner or whatever. So it, I think, takes us back to, it particularly reinforces really the humanity of these people. They're not, nameless victims. They're suddenly people who are living lives in the moment. And okay, they might be snuffed out by a shell very next moment, like my partner's great uncle on the Somme. But up that moment, they look the camera squarely in the eye, and they look us squarely in the eye 100 years on, and they say we're living people. And I think that's the really smart thing that this film's done. And we can address the criticisms in a minute, but I think just on the colorization as well. I mean, there was a vogue in the 1980s and 90s where some classic films were colorized because it was felt that modern audiences wouldn't want to watch things like Casablanca if they were shown in the original black and white. Which, again, to any film nerd like me, and I suspect you, is an atrocity, because those films were designed and lit to be black and white. And
and also in a very real way. I mean, I remember the first. I don't know, it must have been 7 or 8 years old. I remember the first time I saw "It's a Wonderful Life," and I remember thinking, going in, black and white. But the sharp focus that you get from black and white footage, the fact that, as you say, it's lit to take into account the need for these different contrasting shades and hues of black through to white, greys and all that sort of stuff, means that you quickly forget. And actually, when you look at again, now as a filmmaker, someone who works with cameras, when you look at films from those early days of colorization, they look muddy. The focus is out. They can't. It's the pursuit of a new technology that compromises the film as an art form. Now, this is slightly off topic for what we're talking about, but in that sense, black and white is arguably in many respects better. But I guess, and this is an opportunity to move forward a little bit, is it a matter of authenticity, though? So in the case of, for example, It's a Wonderful Life, it does not need colorizing, because actually it's first of all, it's all fiction. Secondly, it was designed to be black and white. the World War One as a theatre, or so the Western Front as a theatre, wasn't set designed. In that sense, does it compromise the authenticity and the look, if you want to say that, of the footage to make it colour?
That is a very, very interesting question. It's a question that's caused. I had a very interesting conversation about this on Facebook with a colleague a few weeks ago, because not quite simultaneously with the Peter Jackson film, but there's a book out by a Brazilian, I think she's a digital artist, called Marina Amaral, who's written a book called The Colour of Time, or co-written a book called The Colour of Time, where a narrative of modern history, basically since the onset of photography, has been juxtaposed with her colorized versions of images that we're very familiar with from books, people like General Custer and President Lincoln and so on. But again, very carefully digitally colorized. It's a very striking book. It's doing very well. But there are people who are saying actually, and my colleagues saying actually, that is treating a black and white artifact like a film print or a photographic print or negative actually is destroying that artifact, because it's not authentic anymore. Now, I am, I think, a lot more comfortable with modern colorization now, because it can be done so much more subtly than it used to be. And if you do your research into the colors, look at, for example, on military uniforms, look at surviving examples. What are the colors? What were the dyes that were used at the time? Simple things like the weather. What are the hues in the sky? It takes a lot of time and effort to get it right, but if it's done well with proper research, then you can have something that is almost, if not, well, in fact, you could argue is almost more authentic by being in colour, because the original scene in front of the photographer was in colour. They just weren't able to record it in colour.
No, and you see, now that's an interesting point as well, in so much as I was just about to say, and surely if they could have, they would have, but at the time, because this is very interesting as well, because you mentioned this idea of, I've heard it described as being the development of the Kodak smile, so people knowing, I'm on camera, hello. So at the time you had people with an increasing awareness of being on camera and what that meant, but also the people being filmed and the people doing the filming sort of accepted the technology as it was. There wasn't necessarily an expectation that this was reality in that sense.
Oh, there's a very interesting when lightweight cameras started to appear in Vietnam in the 1960s. There was some anecdotal suggestions that soldiers, knowing they were going to be on TV, would start to behave like John Wayne in a movie rather than in the way they'd been trained.
Yeah.
And so there was so the movie had the very fact that the camera was there had a distorting effect. And I think and again we see it in the Peter Jackson film in They Shall Not Grow Old, because we do see people mugging to camera.
Well, actually, the guy with the bad teeth, he's like, what kind of thing, because he knows he's on camera, but also he's a bit embarrassed, and So there is that. It's a weird thing where they're aware of the camera, but they know that the footage that's being produced is not. In that sense, there isn't an expectation that it will be black, that it will be color. So it's an interesting one whereby, arguably, you're fulfilling the potential of the footage by colorizing it, but at the same time as well, you're not necessarily. It's not. You can go both ways basically in terms of authenticity, I think. But something that does come to mind though is this idea of the ultimate effect of the treatment of the footage, and what it does for you as the viewer, as a human being watching this, because. Again, if you talk about authenticity, that footage was then staged and presented in very particular ways. It was edited and presented to the public in a certain way. So really, in many ways, no one has ever seen actual authentic World War One footage. It's always had an agenda, especially if it's in the public sphere. But the net effect, the end of this process, when you weigh up the pros and cons, is ultimately an experience that certainly for me reinvigorated that time and place in a way that you can't quite get from, for example, watching a Spielberg film, or in a way that you can't quite get, unfortunately, from watching silent black and white footage. You hear, you feel, and you see, and you smile, and then I did get a bit teary at this as well. You go through that emotional ride, and of course, yes, it's been crafted, and of course, in that sense, there's a narrative that's designed to take you up and down. But ultimately, this footage was always going to be monkeyed with in some way by someone, whether it's a government, whether it's the War Department, whether it's Peter Jackson, whether it's a museum. Um, and also as well, actually another thing as well. I suppose this is probably a point to. I'll let you have a last word as well. But a point to try and close this on as well is that this is also not an act of vandalism. The footage survives.
Precisely.
The footage continues to exist. This is simply a prism applied to elements of that footage, and if people now want to go and find the original stuff, it's still there. It hasn't been physically painted or changed or altered by this process.
I think that's a key point. And in the end, it's horses for courses. You might like it, you might not. It's an artistic creation, and you can choose to take it at whatever level you want to, or reject it. Absolutely spot on. I think, really, and to sum it up, first of all, I think it has set the bar very high for the use of original footage in documentaries now. It is a landmark film in terms of what they've been able to achieve with it, and the impact it's had with the public. It's been, it was being talked about. It's been getting 4 and 5 star reviews everywhere. It's made people discuss the ethics of it, like we're doing now, which is when it, particularly in this era of alternative facts and fake news, and make up your own history.
Well, and also in an era when everyone has a camera in their pocket as well.
Well, that absolutely.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. In 100 years' time, someone making a documentary about the events in Syria will be using everything from iPhone footage to broadcast footage to whatever. And we talked about a few months ago. We talked about the Dan Cruikshank, Don McCullen documentary about Syria and Palmyra. So there are many creative responses to history and conflict. And I think this, as I say, this one it's a remarkable one for the technical achievement. It has an immediacy, which I don't think scholars can ignore.
No,
because it doesn't fit with it doesn't fit with a sort of purist agenda about use of sources. And I think it actually does tell us some things that maybe or reinforce some things that maybe particularly non-specialists would have been aware of. Like, the World War One wasn't an experience of hell on earth 365 days a year between 1914 and 1918.
Or things like, for example, the fact that there was a rotation of troops on the front.
Precisely.
So you go there for a few days, and then, I think would it be like 12 days maybe, and then
it depends on where and when, but I mean, exactly. And the other thing about it, that these were very much individuals with an individual look and an individual sound, and that actually the image that we grew up with in the 60s with "Oh, What a Lovely War," which grew out of the disenchantment expressed by largely middle-class officers like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen through their poetry and writing, Robert Graves through his autobiography, Goodbye to All That. Views from the 1920s and 1930s. I mean, Owen wasn't published in his lifetime. And obviously he was killed right at the end of the war on, I think, the 7th of November 1918. He never lived to see his success as a, quote, war poet. So I think, this is a really necessary, useful contribution to the debate, and one that was done with integrity, I think.
Okay.